Hello, good evening, and a very warm welcome to the Council for British Archaeology's annual evening with archaeologists from the National Trust. My name is Clem Cooper. I'm a trustee of the CBA and I'm helping to host tonight's event. I'm a community practitioner in the museum sector, but in a former role as a community archaeologist, I worked in partnership with the National Trust, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about their current events. I'm joining you from Cambridge. We'd love to know where you're joining from, so please say hello and tell us where you are in the chat. While we give people a few more minutes to log on, I'll take this opportunity to ask you to abide by the CBA's Code of Conduct to ensure that this is a welcoming and enjoyable experience for everyone. You'll see a link in the chat. This is our 5th annual evening with the National Trust Archaeologists. If you haven't joined us before, our format for this event is 3 20-minute talks from each of our speakers with 30 minutes for questions at the end. If you have any questions for our speakers, and I hope that lots of you will, please add them to the Q&A box. It's my pleasure to welcome another fellow East Anglian archaeologist, Shannon Hogan. Shannon is a centrally based national archaeologist for the National Trust, and I'm going to hand over to her now to introduce herself and our speakers.
Thanks so much, Clem. Amazing to see all the chat coming through. I can see quite a lot of international listeners joining us, which is wonderful to hear. There's too many coming in, I can't read them quick enough. Just to let you know, we've already made some sacrifices to the Zoom gods, so all going well, we should have no technical glitches this evening. Thank you so much, Clem. I am what's called a national archaeologist for the National Trust. I've been in the trust for about 8 years. Effectively, it sounds like a rather grand title, but what I do is support our places to do more things with more archaeology and with more people, essentially across our places in the National Trust. But what is archaeology in the National Trust, and why are you all here? What are you here to listen to? Well, you're going to hear from our team or some of our team that it's not all about excavations, as you might expect. So in reality, the team here supports long-term research at our places that helps us understand, manage, and care for our historic environments now, but also for the future. Of course, we do like to dig. We do like to get our hands dirty at times. You'll see us popping up on Digging for Britain. You'll see us popping up even on things like Countryfile from time to time. But it is a special breed of archaeologists that we have here, whose breadth and extent of knowledge I find truly inspiring every single day. So I am honoured and privileged to be presenting 3 of our team who are going to be talking to you tonight. First of all, we're going to have the Stonehenge landscape, 10,000 years in the making, from Dr. Nick Snashall. That's going to be followed by In Pursuit of Saints in the North from Mark Newman. And then we're rounding off with Janine Young, who's going to take us through the Attingham Estate, a changing landscape for people and nature. So please grab a drink, grab some snacks, sit back and enjoy. And without further ado, I will hand you over to Dr. Nick Snashall. Thank you.
Well, welcome from the depths of slightly wet and windy Wiltshire this evening. This evening, what I'm going to share with you is both some of the deep prehistory of the Stonehenge landscape and some of the work we've been doing over the last almost a decade now, actually, to transform the landscape. Next slide, please. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with where Stonehenge is, but just a quick reminder, it's one half of a UNESCO World Heritage Site, along with its counterpart, Avebury, which is a little over 20 miles to the north. They're both in Wiltshire. Avebury sits on the Marlborough Downs, and Stonehenge and its landscape are on the fringes of Salisbury Plain. Altogether, it's 52 square kilometres, so it's quite an enormous patch. And altogether, the National Trust owns and cares for just over 15 square kilometres, so that's about a third of the entire World Heritage Site. Next slide, please. So you'll all doubtless recognise this monument, which sits in the middle of the landscape that we care for. This is actually cared for by English Heritage Trust, but the landscape surrounding it is entirely cared for by the National Trust. And we're very aware of what a precious thing the World Heritage Site is, and the Stonehenge landscape in particular is. As the UNESCO inscription tells us, both of these landscapes are landscapes without parallel. So our maxim here is that they need treating with exceptional care, and we should be protecting them for everyone forever. Next slide, please. So what sort of thing do we actually care for in that landscape? Well, to the left of the image here, what you can see are New King barrows. These are some of the largest and in all probability the oldest of the early Bronze Age barrows in the Stonehenge landscape. If any of you have ever explored the wider landscape, you will know that these sit fringing the approaches up the Stonehenge Avenue as it crests the hill on King Barrow Ridge overlooking Stonehenge itself. And the Stonehenge cursors here in the middle of the image, much older than Stonehenge itself. If you look at the bottom of the Stonehenge cursors image, the fence line there sits just outside of the western boundary of the cursors. And if you look into the far distance, you can just make out a line of trees. And that line of trees is the other end of that gigantic monument. It's 1.75 miles long. We know from radiocarbon dates it was built sometime between 3600 and 3300 BC. So at least 3 centuries before even the earliest parts of Stonehenge itself were constructed. And to our right-hand side, we see the Winterbourne Stoke Crossroads barrows, which the Trust owns a very large part of. We don't actually own the Long Barrow, but the majority of it is in our ownership. And if any of you have travelled on the A303, you'll know the roundabout that the Winterbourne Stoke Crossroads sit by. These are just a tiny fraction of what we care for in this landscape. Next slide, please. So the greyed out area in this image gives you a sense of the landscape that we care for, which sits at the centre of this half of the World Heritage Site, with Stonehenge itself sitting in that little triangle of purple in the middle. The Stonehenge Avenue, which I spoke about, you can see running all the way from the River Avon down towards the bottom right-hand side up to Stonehenge itself, cresting the top of the ridge at New King Barrows, which is that line of that yellow line that sits halfway along the avenue. And the cursors is a gigantic monument that goes from left to right across here. Up in the top right-hand side, we have the area of Dorrington Walls Henge, which we now know is the settlement that belonged to the builders of one of the latest phases of Stonehenge, the Great Grey Sarsen phase, which is so recognisable today. But we first came to acquire parts of the Stonehenge landscape way back in 1927. And it's rather a bizarre story, really. The Stonehenge landscape has lots of surprises. And one of the things that quite a lot of people aren't aware of is that for many years, in the years just before, during and after the First World War, it was the site of an airfield, the Stonehenge Aerodrome as it was known, which by 1917 became the home to what was known as the #1 School of Aerial Navigation and Bomb Dropping, which is a little bit troubling when you think Stonehenge is in the middle of it. But by 1927, most of those buildings, the aerodrome having gone out of use, were pretty much derelict, and they were being used for all sorts of industrial purposes. Some of them had become temporary accommodation, some of them were being used as factories. And there was a public perception that Stonehenge itself, and certainly all the landscape immediately around it, was under threat. So there was a campaign launched led by the great and good of the day, including Stanley Baldwin, Ramsay MacDonald, and for those of you that know your aerial photography, you'll be aware of the name O.G.S. Crawford, who with Alexander Keeler produced a very famous volume, Wessex from the Air. And this campaign was started with the intention of raising funds in order to then pass the landscape that was acquired through purchase to the National Trust. And that's what happened between 1927 and 1929. And just the immediate area around the stones at that point was acquired. Subsequently, we've gone on to acquire and protect much more of it. Next slide, please. So, delving back much further than the early 20th century into the history of Stonehenge, We've touched on some of the enormous monuments that preceded it, like the Stonehenge cursus, but actually the prehistory of the Stonehenge landscape goes well back before that. And for those of you that remember what Stonehenge looked like before the present visitor centre was constructed, you'll remember there used to be a car park situated just where the point of this arrow was shown. Now, that car park was constructed in 1969. And when it was being built, a lady called Faith Thatcher, who at the time was the keeper of the Alexander Keeler Museum at Avebury, carried out an archaeological watching brief there. And somewhat to everyone's surprise, she discovered a row of Mesolithic, so hunter-gatherer post holes. These were quite enormous. They're over a metre in depth and width. It transpired that what they contained was pine posts. But they dated to somewhere around 9000 BC. So that takes us way back into the prehistory of the Stonehenge landscape. Next slide, please. But there have been more recent discoveries as well that have confirmed that there was more activity going on at this period in the Stonehenge landscape. So up here, if we look at the map on the right-hand side, where the arrow is, this is where the remains of a gigantic pit were discovered round about, let's think about this, 2018, with a team from the University of Ghent, Dr. Philippe de Smet, alongside a couple of archaeologists from the University of Birmingham, Henry Chapman, and Paul Garwood. And what you can see in the left-hand side is an image of just the top of the pit that was discovered. So you can see it has quite a V-shaped top to it. As it turned out, what we could see was that this plummeted down to almost 2 meters in depth and went vertically down from this point. And this appears to have been a Mesolithic hunting trap. In the bottom of it was found a type of flint point known as a Horsham point, which is a projectile for hunting. We have really solid radiocarbon dates from it that tell us that this was in use around about 8000 BC. And we think it was for the hunting of wild cattle, the Eroxen, that would have been quite widespread in the Avon Valley, we believe, at this time. Next slide, please. So this is a map that shows you just some of what that team uncovered using a technique called electromagnetic induction, a geophysical survey technique. Every one of these spots on this map is what we believe is a prehistoric pit. A whole series of them were ground truthed, and these are all pits that are at least 2.4 meters in diameter. So we're not talking small here. Our early Mesolithic pit, you can see up towards the right-hand side here, but there were a whole series of other pits tested by excavation, all of which turned out to be prehistoric. So you can see the sheer quantity of archaeology in this landscape over and above all of the legally protected monuments that we saw on our first map that were represented by those yellow areas. Next slide, please. Now, one thing we do know about this landscape, thanks to the work of environmental specialists like Dr. Mike Allen and Professor Charlie French, is that the Stonehenge landscape, from at least the beginning of the Mesolithic onwards, appears to have been a largely open chalk grassland landscape. There would have been areas of mosaic scrub and a few trees, a bit of a thicket of trees, in fact, just in the Avon Valley itself. But most of the landscape was pretty open. Now, in the last century, England has lost over 80% of its species-rich chalk grassland, which is quite something to ponder. And half of what remains is actually in Wiltshire, an awful lot of it on the Salisbury Plain training area, where the MOD carry out so many of their military exercises. Next slide, please. Now, we mentioned that the Stonehenge landscape, part of a World Heritage Site, like many World Heritage Sites, it has a management plan. And the number one priority of that management plan is to protect its buried archaeology. And the reason for that is that over many years, there has been really significant damage from ploughing. Next slide, please. Now, we know that there is damage from ploughing because, as we can see on the left-hand side, this is a shot at the bottom left of the lines demonstrate areas of plough scarring. This was work carried out by Historic England in the area to the south of the A303, known as West Amesbury Farm, close to where what's known as the Conabury Henge and the Conabury Feasting Pit are. And all of this, you can see how shallow the plough soils are. And on the right-hand side, also discovered as part of that project, and likewise the tops of this were subject to ploughing, we can see some of the really delicate remains that lie buried here. These are the remains of two crouched burials of Middle Bronze Age date. So from the period shortly after some of the latest carvings that we know of on Stonehenge would have been created. Next slide, please. So, as a result of the damage that was being done by archaeology, one of our ambitions has always been to try to protect the historic environment, but also to work with nature to address biodiversity loss. We also wanted to improve access. Significant areas of the Stonehenge landscape we've already opened up to permissive open access. And by putting areas down to grassland, that also helps us capture carbon and prevent runoff. Next slide, please. So over the best part of a couple of decades, in bits and pieces, we've been carrying out grassland reversion across the Stonehenge landscape. And what you can see on the right-hand side here is an area just to the south of Durrington Walls, and Durrington Walls itself is that large ring. You might be able to make out the bank on the top right-hand side of this image. Within this field, as you can see from the geophysical survey results here, that's the remains of a long barrow that was uncovered by the Hidden Landscapes project. And down to the right, we have the remains of both round barrows and late Neolithic wooden structures. It's set above the Avon Valley. We purchased this land around the turn of the millennium, and we reverted the area, all of which was under arable, to grass. Next slide, please. Likewise, in 2011, after we'd acquired the area of the mini-me of the Stonehenge cursus, the lesser cursus as it's known, we put this area down to grassland. Next slide, please. But for many years, unfortunately, much of the landscape remained under arable cultivation. And it wasn't until 2020 that we were able to take an opportunity that arose to take some of our land back in hand and to convert it from arable cultivation to species-rich chalk grassland. To do this, we have reverted over 200 hectares of land, which is an enormous area. Normally, you're talking a couple of acres for this sort of project. We used locally provenanced seed, which came from the Salisbury Plain training area. And it was something, the scale and complexity of which is rarely seen. We understand that it's probably the largest project of its kind in Europe. Next slide, please. What that meant was using techniques that protected the archaeology, protected the very valuable seed, and was done at scale. Normally, what you would do to a landscape like this, if you're reverting it to species-rich chalk grassland, is to plough it. But clearly, once we had the land back in hand, we never wanted to plough any of those monuments again. So essentially, we developed techniques that simply tickled the top of the land to open it up in order to be able to seed. Next slide, please. So this slide gives you a sense of the work we've done in the course of the last 20 years, but in particular in the area to the south of the A303, where you can see the light green, and the areas of light green to the right-hand side at the top, and the yellow that you can see on the right-hand side. All of these have been reverted within the last 4 years. Next slide, please. To give you some sense of what that means in terms of the protection of the archaeology, altogether, just within this 4 years, not the earlier phases of the project, it means that 91 sites and monuments are now protected from the plough, all of which were previously under cultivation. So that amounts to 24 Bronze Age round barrows, a significant part of the Stonehenge Avenue, the part that you can see, if you see the diagonal pair of lines in the top right-hand side of this image, that's all gone down to grassland. A Middle Neolithic occupation site and a Neolithic henge and house, which you can see marked as Coneybury Henge in the middle of this image, as well as an early Neolithic feasting pit. Next slide, please. So just to give you an idea, and these images come from, on the right-hand side, some work by the Stonehenge Environs project that was carried out by Julian Richards back in the late 80s and early 90s. And on the left-hand side, some images that were adapted from that by Professor Josh Pollard. So what we now know is that the Coneybury Henge, the bank of which you can see, and the bottom image, contained what is now being interpreted as a Neolithic house. It was difficult to recognise this in the 1980s because none had been found from this period, other than the examples in stone that had been discovered in the Orkneys. Late Neolithic houses on the southern Chalkland are incredibly rare, and it wasn't until we started finding them first on Cranbourne Chase and latterly at Durrington Walls we were able to recognise it. And on the right-hand side is a truly rare thing. It's an image of a Neolithic pit from the early Neolithic, which recent reanalysis has shown was not only the site of feasting, but was in all probability one of the very few places where the last of the hunter-gatherers met the first farmers in southern Britain. Next slide, please. So what do we want to do from here? Well, the archaeology is now protected. All of our land in the Stonehenge landscape is now down to grassland. The vast majority of it is species-rich chalk grassland. Those areas that are not, we will be reseeding and plug planting to ensure that there's ecological gain and a richness and a biodiversity there for visitors to enjoy. That's a large part of what we want to do over the future years. Once the grassland is properly established, what we'd like to do is open up even wider areas for people to enjoy much more of the Stonehenge landscape. So hopefully in future years, you'll all be able to explore and enjoy parts of that landscape that I've been talking about this evening. Next slide, please. One of the beauties of the Stonehenge landscape is its vistas. And one of the things we would very much like to see is a landscape that doesn't recreate, but in future years allows people to experience something that just gives them a sense of what's been here for the last 10,000 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was wonderful. Sorry, my camera is just having a there we go, having a bit of a wobble. I said there'd be no technical issues, and they were my technical issues. Thanks, Nick. That is absolutely brilliant. Really, really wonderful to hear. Just a quick reminder to everyone, there is a Q&A box if you want to pop questions in there, just so we can keep track of them. It's easier than trying to find them in the chat, although I am making a note of the things that I've seen pop up. And just before I introduce our next speaker, Mark, just a little heads up to let people know that we've got listeners from Malta, the USA, Canada, Czech Republic, Germany, New Zealand, and someone who's come all the way from their sofa, they said in the chat as well. So thank you especially to that person. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mark Newman in Pursuit of Saints in the North. Thank you, Mark.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for that, Shannon. Lovely to meet you all. I'm Mark. I'm one of the 3 National Trust archaeologists in our Great Northern region, so looking after the whole of the north of England up to the Scottish border. It's lovely to think that you're joining us from so many other different parts of the world, especially all our friends from the United States. And can I just say I'm certainly available for a lecture to come the winter. My subject tonight is going to draw together some little pieces of work well, some of them quite big pieces of work that we're doing on some of the sites that I help advise on my patch, which is really the Yorkshire Ridings, County Durham, Northumberland up to the Tyne, and then a little bit along the coast as well. The thing that brings these three little stories together really is the way in which archaeology can contribute to all sorts of different areas of what are called heritage values. So how we understand why places are important. We usually say they are evidential, so that's what does the archaeology physically tell you about a place? Well, that's always our stuff. Historical, so which historical story is it illustrating, or is it significant for being the first place that does X, Y, and Z? Its aesthetic value, is it designed to look beautiful, or is it just beautiful of its nature? And then there's the fourth one, which trots on behind, which is the social communal value, it's called, which is its value to people. And to be honest, that's often the value that kind of trots along behind the other big three hitters and doesn't get quite so much press, but it's fundamentally important to what we do in the National Trust. And under that heading comes spirituality. And these three stories tell you a little bit about aspects of spirituality that's being emphasized by the archaeological research that I've been involved with. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this really is going from one extreme of our enormously prominent and large sites at Stonehenge down to some of the very tiniest. This little site is called Ladies' Well. You might just be able to see it up towards the top of this extract of the 1890s Ordnance Survey. It is a tiny little property that is not in any of the National Trust handbooks anymore. It's looked after by Cragside, and a lot of its character is it's an extraordinary special little spot that really has a wonderful character to it. It's been a place of pilgrimage for a long period of time by people from a range of different interests, and it's fascinating today how the traditional Christian audience for the site has been augmented by those that align with spirituality that more comes from place and from nature. So you get a little glimpse of basically what the site is, which is this tank of water now with a cross in the centre, and with his back to us, a statue of St. Paulinus. The site is known as Ladies' Well. And it's been one whose spirituality has sort of come and gone over the course of time. The first time that we hear the site being mentioned in the 16th century, it's reported that it is said that St. Paulinus on Easter Day 627 baptized 3,000 Northumbrians here, but he didn't really. It's actually somebody mistranscribing the Venerable Bede, and that baptism actually took place in York, not here in the outer reaches of Northumberland, close to the Scottish border, miles away from anywhere. So back in the 16th century, we knew it really wasn't the place where the baptisms took place, but that story has sort of come back and bit people time and time again. Ladies' Well seems a very obvious etymology. So a well, a sacred space dedicated to St. Mary, Our Lady, and that's easy, isn't it? It's a place of medieval significance. Next slide, please. So this is what the site actually looks like today. So the National Trust bit is just the bit inside the walled enclosure with all the trees in the centre. Next slide, please. And this is how the site appeared in the 19th century. We think this is the earliest photograph of it back from the 1860s on the left-hand side. The real problem started when I pulled at the edges of this for writing the conservation plan for the property, but there is absolutely no reference to this site being referred to as Ladies' Well before the early 19th century. It is all done by extrapolation by authors that it was quite definitely a place of medieval religious significance because it was owned by a little nunnery that existed in the adjoining village of Holystone. None of these pieces join up. There is no evidence for medieval worship at this site. It doesn't seem to be much more than an agricultural landscape run by the nunnery in order to provide enough for its subsistence. But the story hangs on and it keeps coming back, and St. Paulinus keeps coming back, and everybody says, no, that's not really a thing. The real story of the appearance of a site today is it is a tiny 18th century designed landscape. and this site was remade by its owners to take up its present form that you see it in today, as an enjoyable little moment as you went round the estate. There was even a table for having a picnic off, which is sort of up at the back of the beyond the wooden arch you can see in the bottom right hand image. Next slide, please. The site is a scheduled ancient monument. The scheduling description refers to the medieval back history, but also takes it further and suggests that as a natural spring producing something like 500 gallons an hour of water running through it, it may have been a watering point adjacent to a Roman road that was found by the antiquarian McLaughlin in the 1850s. And in the landscape just down to the southwest of the National Trust property, that does appear as a pretty decent surface feature with Iron Age or Roman earthworks associated with it. McLaughlin's plan gives us a nice dotted line going on in this direction, and if you continue the dotted line, you do run past Ladies Well. Next slide, please. The trouble is, no one has been able to find it. And it's not for the want of trying. McLaughlin's description is, well, I couldn't really find it, but I think I found some stones in a field boundary, which certainly justified drawing a straight line from A to B that runs alongside the site, and the Ordnance Survey obligingly added that detail. The local community are very interested in their archaeology, and in 2005, they brought in professional geophysicists to do a survey across these fields, which again found no trace of the Roman road whatsoever. What it did find, marked up here in red on the LiDAR survey, were a series of what were taken to be hut circles, which was a disappointment if you're looking for a Roman road. But actually, if you look at them, they've got quite an interesting alignment between them, which takes up the alignment of Ladies Well in its enclosure. Next slide, please. And the sense of these features comes full in, it hits you full in the face really when you pop the LiDAR data into 3 dimensions, and that actually all the roundhouses are on this raised hillock with a rampart feature around it, which the medieval ridge and furrow sort of pleats its way into. It's clearly a much earlier structure. And I think that if it wasn't a medieval place of worship, it does seem to have been a prehistoric one. Our first reference to Ladies Well comes in 1716 when it's visited by the antiquary John Warburton, an absolutely fascinating figure in his own right, and he describes the well broadly in the form in which you see it now, and very interestingly adds the point that it was in past times a place of resort and pilgrimage for the local recusants, so Catholics practicing their faith in Protestant England. Next slide, please. And this is where I think the spirituality of the place really comes into focus for what it actually is rather than what people have perceived. This is the very earliest use of Ladies Well. It's also the first illustration of mapping of this landscape, which shows virtually reverse in terms of tree planting from what you see today, with the fields embracing all the way around the well with these screening woodlands, no woodland shown actually on the Ladies Well site itself. What we now believe this site to be is a place of recusant worship, a place for baptism. Catholics were tolerated, and there were many Catholics who lived in this part of the world. What they couldn't do was use Church of England churches for their sacraments. Other arrangements had to be made. People were allowed to pay to have private chapels, but they weren't for places of public worship. I think that this is an extremely rare evidence of a response from the recusant community finding places that they found sacred in the landscape. And Ladies Well, I can't really think of a better one for them to have focused their devotions upon. Next slide, please. So from one small religious site to one very large one, and the evidence that we do have World Heritage sites in the north of England as well. I've spent a lot of my time with the Trust working here at Fountains Abbey, and this is just a very little quick update on one aspect of the research we've been carrying out there. When I first arrived at Fountains, I was pretty much told, well, everybody's done the archaeology of Fountains in the 19th century. It was all published in 1900. Move on, nothing new to see here. Fortunately, we live in an age with extraordinary advances in archaeological technology that is allowing us to look beneath the surface of the ground in places that don't look like they've been touched since medieval times and finding the most extraordinary archaeological resource. The chap you can see on the left here pushing the baby buggy, but he's lost the baby, is a wonderful man called Mike Langton, and this is a ground penetrating radar. So it's giving us signals down through the ground, which have also a wonderful geophysical technique. You can actually read them in horizontal layers going down through the ground. What we were looking for was a 19th century drain, so we could relay it and take surface water away from the abbey, which was supposed to have exited the abbey ruins here and gone into the river. It would have been lovely if we'd been able to find it. In fact, we discovered that the Victorian journalist who described it got it in the wrong place, and it's over here. But this arrangement of black rectangles are actually stone-lined monastic graves. So here we were able to reveal the plan of the monastic cemetery and doing all that in 3 dimensions. And we went out to the media with this in 2016 with this image that you can see here, which made quite an international stir. Since then, we've gone back to the site a number of occasions with increasingly sophisticated geophysical equipment. Next slide, please. So in 2018, we took our area of survey on beyond the cemetery that you can see here. At this stage in development, we reckon we found 2,000 graves in total in at least 8 different types of configuration that represent the expansion of a cemetery over time. But our survey pushing on down the East Green beyond the Abbey, the real surprise was discovering these buildings. Now, for those of you who are fortunate enough to know Fountains, if you look back to the left, you can see the Chapel of the Nine Altars. This building is considerably larger than the footprint of the Chapel of the Nine Altars, an aisled hall structure which we believe crossed the river, and a second building to the right of that. And this is we've interpreted as being the monastic tannery, which is known from documents but not known on the ground. Fountains is the defining type site for Cistercian monasteries. So when you start adding completely new things into its ground plan, even if it's been studied for 300 years, that's quite a nice moment in a career. Next slide, please. Now, this was going to be a piece of clever me moving hands around and showing you a little bit of video going at the same time. This is from our latest revisit of the site, going even further down the valley in October of 2023, so 2024. But I'm not going to ask Claire to fiddle with that, as Zoom has thwarted our efforts to control our own presentations. But basically, this is going beyond Mike pushing the baby buggy. We're now able to mount the equipment on an electric vehicle and actually as the data is being collected, seeing it on screen, building up in stripes as we travel up and down the valley. Next slide, please. Ah, you did manage to get the video going. And hopefully without the soundtrack, which is me and Mike talking about our favorite cars. Next slide, please. And this is some of the latest material to emerge from our surveying with Bradford. So we've now taken the survey down to the, almost down to the monastic precinct wall, over to the right-hand side of the image that you see here. You've got ground penetrating radar results in the upper part of the screen and magnetometry results below. There's all sorts of technology interests in understanding this landscape. The magnetometry is a technique which is widely used on archaeological sites, and it is incredibly striking how absolutely nothing that the ground penetrating radar is able to show us appears on that magnetometry survey. It is a new way of seeing into the ground entirely, which I think it would be brilliant in any circumstances, but here at Fountains, where we can now see we've probably got 2.5 meters of unexplored stratified archaeology, other techniques just don't get to the depths of that. And going back to my theme of spirituality, you've got to remember that all the activities that take place on the site that this investigation is showing us were means of devotion and worship on the part of the monks. And the burial of the monks and the way that it can now be seen to be evolving over time, different burial practices are taking place. And I'm pretty certain that the concept of corporeal resurrection, so the importance of preserving bodies in place, is reflecting the religious understanding of the residents of a monastery in the first place. And as I said, when we first went public about the cemetery, it's an extraordinary feeling. You know that this is a monastery and it involved monks somewhere along the way. It's the revelation that it's not that the monks have gone, they're still here and they always have been. And this is an ongoing spiritual value to this place. Next slide, please. I take far too much of the credit for all of this. I just want to put in this slide as a you have been watching cast list thing. All this incredible work we've been going on fountains, and the GPR and the cemetery is only one part of a multifaceted project, has been done in collaboration with wonderful friends at Bradford University for over a dozen years now. And they continue to pour their expertise and their love into creating this amazing new knowledge and understanding of the place. And I'm only here really to kind of do the song and dance at the end of the process. Next slide, please. Third tranche of the story, and another one of our significant sites in the north. So we now go way up to the north and off the Northumberland coast to the Farne Islands. And here we're writing a new conservation management plan for the property. Property came to the trust 100 years ago this year, and has been, well, before the National Trust time, but all the way through the National Trust time. A really major focus of it has been the natural history of the site, and that tends to be what people associate with the farms, which is extraordinary because it has 1,000 years of religious history present on this site as well. This was the site of a hermitage of St. Aidan and then St. Cuthbert, and then subsequent Anglo-Saxon religious figures living using this island as a hermitage, and Cuthbert becomes an extraordinarily important figure in the whole dynamic of religion and politics and society across the whole of the north of England. The buildings that you see here, this is from the first stage of our investigation of the site. This is actually a photogrammetric model of the islands. So to the right, you have St. Cuthbert's Chapel. It'd be nice to think it was Anglo-Saxon, but it's not. It's built in the 13th century. The building to the left has been suggested to be a second chapel. We now don't actually think that it is. And the building beyond is the second oldest in-use building owned by the National Trust in the north of England, Prior Commons Tower, built as a residence for the prior of Durham Cathedral in the 1490s, and subsequently saw life as a fort and as a lighthouse, and now as a bunk room for our rangers on the islands. Next slide, please. So as I said, the islands primarily have a focus around these cute little people, and why wouldn't it? They come every year and nest on the islands. There is an acknowledgement of the cultural heritage importance of this place, but it's very much sort of, and St. Cuthbert was here. Meanwhile, look, there's Puffin, and people go off and do that. And why not? It's just splendid. And it's a wonderful moment when nature and archaeology absolutely come together, because Cuthbert's life on the islands was so, and the stories are so interwoven with the creatures that lived here, that this is a point where the veil of time is vanishingly thin. And this is a place where you experience it and you experience its creatures in precisely the way that St. Cuthbert did at the end of the 7th century, beginning of the 8th century. Next slide, please. So we saw a zoomed in little bit of Call of Duty visits the Farne Islands with the first slide in the sequence. This is kind of zooming right back out. So the stuff that we can do with the photogrammetric surveys that we've produced. So we now have these corrected ortho images of the island as a way of being able to complete a ground survey over the whole of the surface of the islands at a high level of precision. Next slide, please. And from this, we've constructed something that is akin to a LiDAR model of the whole ground surface of the islands. And this, I've put this slide in just as an illustration of you can have too much of a good thing. So this is how the data first came back, and we thought, well, that's sort of not very helpful. And this is actually 5 centimeter resolution imaging. And the vegetation is just not friendly to looking at things in that sort of detail. Next slide, please. So we've in fact reprocessed it as if it was 20 centimetre resolution data, and lo and behold, things start to become a lot more interesting. So in the centre of the islands, I'm sure you've all picked out the ridge and furrow, which when you measure its extent is exactly the extent that the documents of Durham Cathedral say was being cultivated in the 14th century. It's been particularly useful for looking at areas outside the ridge and furrow as well. And the most extraordinary fact that the blob towards the bottom is a lighthouse, but it's only one part of the original complex. And there was a second, the low light, up to sort of 11 o'clock from that building, which has left absolutely no surface indication at all. The thing is, we don't understand how the soil came to exist on this island, what it's doing and how it's behaving. And we want to explore that to know that the archaeology can be conserved, and we'll understand the changes that it faces in light of climate change and changing sea levels. Next slide, please. So zooming in a bit closer, obviously the key focus of interest is the vicinity of the present buildings and the assumption that this is the area where St Cuthbert's original hermitage might have been. It is extraordinary to say that despite the interest of this site, there has been scarcely any archaeological research here previously. There have been studies of the buildings, particularly by Peter Ryder, which have been very useful. We're just going back and revisiting that knowledge now. And there was one afternoon from a chap from the Ministry of Works came and dug a hole and thought he might have found something interesting in 1930. But other than that, this really hasn't been looked at before. And it seems an extraordinary opportunity to go back to the island's beginnings. Next slide, please. Zooming in again, LiDAR, or rather not LiDAR, photogrammetry here, you can produce imagery in all sorts of different ways, and the different visualizations bring out different things for you. So we've zoomed in, and at the bottom you can see the ends of the ridge and furrow cut across by the gardening put in by the lighthouse keepers, so rubbing out any earlier trace on the surface. But in fact, we think the soils there are about 5 feet thick, so who knows what lies underneath that. To the right, you've got these various scoops, which this imagery has really, it's a difficult site to read on the ground, but shows these different scoops, which were for tapping into spring water supply, which is on the island. And there are legends of St Cuthbert's Well, supposedly under the site of a chapel, but actually the number of other candidate locations. Probably the most interesting areas to us at the moment is to the north of the chapel, as you're looking at it on this plan, an area that is now used as a kind of rubbish yard by the rangers, but offers really interesting possibilities of early archaeology. Next slide, please. And then when you change the visualization, different things come to light. Targets for early investigation are going to be, I'm pointing at my screen, that's not helping you. Can you see the circular features up to the northwest from the left-hand rectangular block, Prior Castle's Tower, and another one to the northwest? These circular features we can't currently explain, and we're planning to explore them further. Again, with Bradford University, we are carrying out geophysical surveys on the islands, and I had hoped that we'd have some of the first images for that to show you tonight, but they're not quite ready for use yet. But we went out last autumn and gathered those, and when the puffins have gone away and the lettuce onto the site again, we'll be back in the autumn to come to take that survey further. Next slide, please. So the stories of St Cuthbert make you stop and think, surely there is something that could be archaeological surviving here. Because what Bede tells us about Cuthbert, what the other medieval lives of Cuthbert tell us about, is that his oratory consisted of a circular depression, here depicted on the left, which the saint with his own hands hewed the rock to cut something 60 to 80 feet in diameter, and use the rocks that he cut, which were so large that God had to send an angel down to help him lift them, to make a wall around the outside of the hole, so that all he could see when he was at prayer were the heavens to focus his observations. A rock cut hole 60 to 80 feet wide. That would be an interesting thing to look at with a ground penetrating radar, wouldn't it? That's what I'm hoping we might find some trace of. Bede is not a precise contemporary with Cuthbert. He was born before Cuthbert's death, they overlap, but he's writing at the next monastic institution down the coast, and new places where Cuthbert had directly been. So his reporting is pretty first-hand. I very much like the image on the right, which is that Cuthbert asked for a log of an appropriate length for his necessary house, his lavatory, and asked the monks to bring him such timber on their next visit, and they forgot. And everybody went to bed going, my bad. And in the morning, the Lord had provided and washed up on the shore a log of the right length. Next slide, please. And if you look up to the north from Prior Castle's tower, we've got St Cuthbert's Gut, which is this natural reft in the rock, and rather perfect for putting a log across and using to those ends. Cuthbert died on the Farne Islands, and the next stage of the legend is shown on the right, that a signal fire was lit on Farnes, which was seen by the monks on Holy Island, who came and retrieved the saint's body, and he was interred in Holy Island, and so begins the story of his sainthood and the miracles at his grave, and his long journey fleeing ahead of the Viking invasions of northern England. Ultimately, next slide please, he's going to end up here in Durham, the Normans taking a strong control of the story because the north associates with St Cuthbert. St Cuthbert is their patron and they follow him, and this is the political aspects of Norman rule of England, taking control of this situation and investing in it and creating this magnificent cathedral over the shrine of Cuthbert as its principal focus. And the cult of Cuthbert becomes that touch for the whole of the north of England under the Normans. It's an incredibly powerful political thing that begins from the place the National Trust cares for. Next slide, please. I said the veil of time is vanishingly thin in this place. The extraordinary treasures of Durham Cathedral include these items. So in the upper right is the remains of the coffin that Cuthbert's body was placed in the 8th century as it began its journey towards Durham over the centuries to come. Inside the coffin is his comb, a small wooden silver-covered altar, which was his personally. The embroidery is Anglo-Saxon silk embroidered stole, which is probably pressing it a little bit to say it was Cuthbert's directly, but has ended up with his relics. And to the upper left, his pectoral cross that was found on one of the many episodes when Cuthbert's grave was opened, that particular one in the 1820s. Next slide, please. But these are things that directly connect you to a person of the 8th century, one of whose most significant sites is this National Trust place. The resonances go on. One of the occasions when Cuthbert's tomb, which you can see to the right here, was reopened in the 11th century, they discovered other relics put in with his remains, including the head of St Oswald, King of Northumbria, killed in battle against the pagan Mercians. It was found again in the 1820s when it was reopened. The St Oswald becomes a second northern saint and another power structure, which takes us to another National Trust property, Nostell Priory, the home of the St Oswalds, and the centre for cult practice amongst the Augustinian order, dedicated to St Oswald. Nostell came to own places of significance in Oswald's story right up the 150 miles to Bamborough on the coast near the Farne Islands. Next slide, please. And the St Cuthbert story is really only the beginning of the historical and cultural interests on this site. Other than the presence of the Anglo-Saxon monasteries, we know practically nothing about life on this site. We do know that it becomes a possession of the Durham Cathedral. They constructed the buildings that you can see reconstructed here that consisted of guest accommodation for pilgrims coming to this place. The chapel of St Cuthbert that exists, the cross range, is no longer with us, but we're finding it archaeologically. The chapel on the other side is actually probably a refectory, and Prior Commons Tower is a very late arrival in the monastic story of the site, but a proto-country house for a prelate. I mean, these are vanishingly rare types of buildings. The 17th century use of the site of the fort, that has, we know a little bit more from a documentary point of view, but there's more archaeology to find. And then the life of the site as an archaeological place, an antiquarian place. Next slide, please. I just hope this has encouraged you to make a trip to the Farnes for yourself. That veil of time is vanishingly slight into the deep past. And when you land on that landing stage that is there today and you walk up that slope, you are walking directly in the footprints of saints. And that's a very special thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That was incredible. I've heard some of that before, but it's so inspiring every single time you speak about it. So thanks so much. We will move on very swiftly to Janine. There are a lot of questions racking up, so I want to have plenty of time for that. So over to Janine now, who's going to be telling us a lot about the changing landscape for people in nature at Attingham. Thank you, Janine.
Thank you, Shannon, and hello, everybody. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a recent geophysical survey that we've carried out at the Attingham Estate. So we've gone from kind of south to north and we're moving to the Midlands now. So I look after the Midlands part of the country for the National Trust. And next slide, please. Sorry, I have to remember that I need to keep saying. Next slide, please. So yes, Attingham Estate is quite a different property. It's not quite as known for its iconic archaeology as some of the other sites we've been looking at today. It's got no Stonehenge at the centre. What it is, it's a large estate with a designed parkland at the centre and a mansion house, but it's largely taken up with sort of a typical Midlands farmed landscape, and the National Trust have 6 tenant farmers that look after the landscape here. It is rich in archaeological sites such as Roxton Roman City and Frogmore Great Halls, but it's largely the visitor attraction is at the centre of the estate. There's a lot going on at Attingham Estate at the moment. It's got a bold vision for nature recovery, and in line with the National Trust's wider ambitions really around nature recovery, lots of targets at the moment for an increase in woodland cover. There's a really big project going on at the Attingham Estate in order to try and restore river restoration, create wetlands, create priority habitat. So they've been working a lot with tenant farmers at the moment, thinking about what that's going to look like. Next slide, please. This just gives you a little bit of context in terms of where we are. So the Attingham Estate is just outside Shrewsbury, like I say, in the Midlands. It does cover a huge swathe of countryside. You can see the ring road of Shrewsbury. I can't point on this, unfortunately, but just up to the left-hand corner. You've got the confluence of 2 rivers, the River Tern and the River Severn, run through the estate. It's been a very fertile bit of land, and that's been known about, obviously, throughout time. It encompasses a tiny little bit of Roxton Roman City, which you can see right at the centre. You can see the mansion and the parkland in the middle of the estate, and then there was this later development of the Attingham airfield, which also encompasses a bit of the farmland of the estate. Next slide, please. So despite us not having any sort of these major iconic archaeological sites, we've always known that it is a really rich landscape, a really significant landscape, archaeologically speaking. We've got a whole plethora of information that we've built up over the years from bits of evidence that we've gathered, from crop mark evidence, from LiDAR data, but also from things you can actually just see in the landscape. We've got upstanding buildings, lots of field boundaries. So we've always known it to be a really significant landscape. Next slide, please. So when I started working with the team at Attingham, who were trying to think about the nature recovery vision for the estate, we started thinking about how we could sort of incorporate some of those heritage features into that vision? How could we ensure that we were looking at the landscape holistically, taking into consideration the heritage of the landscape? How could we use some of that knowledge of the past to help us inform what we were going to do with the land of the future? And as we started thinking, we realised that despite the fact that we did have a lot of information about the archaeology across the estate, we really just didn't know enough about the buried archaeology, about that potential archaeology that survived in order to kind of design this nature recovery scheme. So what we decided to do quite boldly really was to carry out a geophysical survey of almost the entire estate to see if we could really sort of increase our understanding and gain that kind of really robust knowledge. So we ended up carrying out a magnetometer survey of 1,043 hectares. It is the National Trust's largest ever geophysical project. We were hoping it might be the largest one ever, but I've been reliably informed that it's the UK's 7th largest geophysical project. It's not a competition, but I do believe that some of the work that Nick's done around Stonehenge actually is quite similar in scale. But obviously that's a really big bit of land to cover. It took magnitude surveys, almost 8 months to cover the land, and this is the bit of kit that they used. So you can see it's a magnetometer array mounted on the back of a quad bike, essentially. You can see the array across the bottom and the little GPS tracker on the top that was pulled up and down the fields. Next slide, please. This is just a really quick explanation of what magnetometry is. So it's like Mark was mentioning in his talk. It's not like the ground penetrating radar, which gives you sort of slices through the ground. What it does is it measures the variations in the Earth's ambient magnetic field, and human activity tends to make the ground and material more magnetic, so you can pick up things like ditches and banks, and that was the sort of thing that we were looking for. And really the reason that we did this method is because it is one of the only geophysical methods that you can really cover ground at this kind of scale, with really other methods are much more intense and much more time consuming. Next slide, please. And as they were driving up and down with on their quad bike, the geophysics data was being recorded and transmitted back to me, so I could see it in real time. And technology is an amazing thing at the moment, so I could look on my computer in the office and I could see the results sort of appearing. And this slide just shows you what geophysics survey results for that scale and that size of landscape looks like. And it really did increase our understanding of the landscape of the site. We thought we had a good grasp of what was going on, but actually we identified 61 new sites with the work. You can see just how much there is in a landscape of this size that's essentially unknown about otherwise. But it also improved our understanding of around 90 sites that we perhaps already knew about from aerial photography or from crop marks or from LiDAR data. What it did is it really helped us to understand exactly what was going on in some of these sites, understand the layout and more detail on the features. So it really has sort of revolutionised our understanding of the estate. We finished the work sort of last autumn, and we're really still sort of just going through the data and processing it, because it really is a lot of data there to think about and to consider, and to think about what we can learn about how it changes our understanding of the development of the landscape through time. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to whip through as quite quickly a couple of the main most interesting results from the geophysical survey. Just a bit of a whistle-stop tour, really. There's way too much to include in it all. Starting from the Iron Age period, we think we might have evidence that is earlier, but this is the the period that we first really start to understand the landscape. The top right-hand image gives you a view across Attingham, across the farmed landscape, across to the Wrekin Hill Fort in the distance. So we know there was an Iron Age hill fort here that was really quite dominant in the landscape. You can see it from everywhere at Attingham, and we know it was occupied, likely to be occupied by the Cornovi. We also had a bit of an idea already that this landscape was probably, during the Iron Age, farmed and populated with a scattering of small farmsteads. Next slide, please. And what the geophysics survey really revealed to us is that this perception was right. And what you can see here are a series of enclosures which were picked up during the survey. So you can see this sort of, we call them rectilinear enclosures. They're sort of little square features, usually with a little gap as an entrance way. And the enclosure represents, we imagine, a bank and a ditch surrounding a cluster of features such as a roundhouse, maybe some outbuildings. So these, there are two images here that are what you see when you immediately, the grayscale data from the geophysics. You can see the one in the centre here with the little enclosure, and then you can just make out the circular feature, which we think represents the roundhouse in the middle. And the image on the right is the sort of plots once these features have been transcribed. So what's really interesting about this is that we think we've got at least 8 of these scattered across the landscape. And so it's really interesting to think about how intensively the land was being farmed in this time period. How did they interconnect to each other? We had an idea that there were a couple of these types of settlements in the land, but now we've got a real firm understanding of where they are in the landscape, and we can start to think about what that means in terms of the occupation. So the image at the top is a reconstruction we had commissioned based on the one in the middle, where you can see quite clearly the roundhouse. And this is what we imagine, an artist's impression is that we'd imagine that they would look like. Next slide, please. We do get a whole series of undated features. We're grouping them as undated features at the moment, but I think we can probably fairly confidently date most of these to the prehistoric period at some point. And you can see we've got a variety of different types of sites that are coming up. You can see on the left we've got this quite interesting pentagon-shaped enclosure, which is really quite unusual and not very easily dated to any particular time period, although again we imagine this probably dates to the prehistoric period. Next slide, please. And then moving into the Roman period, we do know, like I showed you on the image before, that there was the Roman city of Wroxeter in really close proximity, and in fact, part of it lies within the Attingham Estate, and that was established first as a legionary fortress, and then it later became a really thriving civilian town, which actually developed into the 4th largest walled city in Britannia. And the image you can see here is actually a bit of upstanding stonework from the city, which sits at the heart of the city, but actually the majority of the city now just lies under pasture. You wouldn't know there was anything there. They are just grazed fields. But obviously the proximity of the landscape at Attingham to this Roman city has really had a big influence on what there is within the landscape. Next slide, please. And this image just shows you a reconstruction of what Wroxeter Roman city would have looked like at its peak. And you can see the red line that I've just kind of sketched on. That bit shows the portion of the city that lies within the Attingham Estate. So that's the bit that's within the care of the National Trust. Next slide, please. And this is just, this is the image, the geophysics plots from the survey of where we've done it within our land at Wroxeter. So you can see quite clearly starting to come through some of the city, some of the the actual city itself had been surveyed before as part of the Wroxeter Hinterland project, but this sort of second chance to have a go at it has really kind of enhanced our understanding of the city. And what you can see here is the sort of red line, which is the city defences, and then picked out in blue are the routeways and the road network essentially through the city. And you can see that they actually carry on beyond the city, and it's quite interesting to look at the density for the survival of the archaeology. And then as you go out further into landscape, that gets lesser and lesser. But we're certainly picking up lots of remains in this area immediately to the north of the city. Next slide, please. And one of the most significant finds, I suppose, really was the confirmation of the location of the Roman cemetery. So it's always been assumed that there would have been a cemetery on one of the roads leading out of the Roman city. The Romans traditionally buried their dead outside of the city walls, usually on a roadway, so they could be visible. So we had pretty high expectations that there was a cemetery somewhere in the vicinity. And if you look at the image, the reconstruction image, they've actually drawn a cemetery on the outskirts of the city, exactly where we found it. But that image was actually drawn before we did the geophysical survey. So it was where we expected it to be, but it had never been actually sort of firmly identified before. And what you can see in the image on the right, the purple represents what we think are the cemetery remains, essentially. And you can see they sit within their little enclosure. So that was quite exciting. People had often wondered where the location of that cemetery was. Next slide, please. We also identified what we think is a series of Roman roads associated with the city. On the image in front of you, you can see a series of postulated routes, so places where people have had a guess that the roads might have led west from the city of Wroxeter. And I think what we've done essentially is clarified that the middle route, which I think is marked as Toller's postulated route, is in fact the route that the road would have originally taken. And you can see where it aligns with my little red line, which is where we have actually identified the road in the geophysical data. And you can see that we've also identified a road running west just across the little island that actually doesn't correspond with any of the postulated routes, but actually probably is the route that led west and then later joined up with the bit that we have located further west. And we think that probably went out to Caerleon and Fordingere. So that was something, again, that's really clarified kind of our understanding of the road networks in this area. Next slide, please. And this is just a little example of what they look like in the geophysical data. So you get this very typical kind of, you pick up the line of the ditches either side of the road. So you can see the one we've identified running west. And then that's just a little image from the geophysics plots of another sort of more local road almost that would have run north-south. Next slide, please. And then we also identified a couple of, they call them high status dwellings. They are essentially Roman villas, we think, within the data. So we think we've got three. Two of those we had no idea were there before. There wasn't any indication in anything we'd picked up previously. So that was quite an exciting discovery. This is just an example of one of them. And you can see the geophysics plot on the left. Again, the indication is, every indication is there that it's probably some kind of villa. Obviously, just from the geophysics, it's impossible to tell for definite. And the image that I've included on the right is actually, we commissioned a reconstruction of of the villa that this plot might represent, and I just included it there because it's quite nice to see how it's been worked up. Obviously, we only have this evidence to go on, so we were playing around with what that little curved feature on the left might have been, and what those, what some of those walls and things might have represented. Next slide, please. So that was the finished product of what we imagined that villa may well have looked like, but obviously at this stage it is all speculation based on kind of knowledge and understanding we have from other similar sites. Next slide, please. And then these are just some examples of the other villas that we think we might have identified. So the one on the left, you can just about make out the sort of regular pattern of the buildings. And then we've got another smaller structure that we think sitting facing the road on the image on the right. Next slide, please. And then leaving the Roman period behind and moving forward quite far in time. And we do have evidence of what was happening in between these periods, but actually not a lot of it showed up on the geophysical data. We don't have much evidence from the medieval period or the post-medieval period, but what you do get at Attingham is patterns forming in the landscape that still survive today. So actually a lot of the evidence from those periods we can still see in the landscape today in terms of field boundaries and buildings. And then just a bit conscious of time, kind of rush forward a little bit, so that we know that part of the site was used in World War II as an airfield site. It was RAF Attingham and became a US Army Air Force site in 1942. They tend to follow a standard blueprint for World War II airfields, with the accommodation dispersed around Attingham. Next slide, please. And we know that it did have a huge impact on the landscape at the time. And actually the geophysics has kind of just really enhanced our understanding of what was going on the site during this time period. We do have a lot of evidence from aerial photographs, and we do have kind of the maps and plans, but actually the geophysics, as you can see on the left, really enhances that, gives you lots more detail, and actually has cleared up some misunderstandings of sites where we had interpreted one of the corners of the airfield as a possible Roman marching camp, but we've obviously clarified here that actually it was still part of that airfield. Next slide, please. And this is just what it all looks like on a map in terms of, if you think about what our understanding was before. I've just marked on this map where some of the enclosures, where some of the villas are, and you can see that perception of the landscape looks quite different now to what we thought it was before. Next slide, please. And then just very quickly, as a follow-up following the geophysical survey, we knew we'd detected some of these quite significant sites. We carried out a metal detecting survey of 5 of the fields with some of the most significant archaeology in it, using a kind of well-known metal detecting society. We carried out very systematically just to see if we could identify the remains in these fields. Next slide, please. I'm just going to give you, this is just a very quick, some quick images from the metal detecting survey, and what we learned really from it. We did learn that some of the fields potentially had already been subject to potentially illegal detecting previously, where we had very few sat finds coming out, but as a general rule, the material, we were finding much greater amounts of material in closer proximity to Roxeter, and the further out you go into the landscape, the less that was found. Next slide, please. Again, this is just a few images of some of the types of things we were finding, largely Roman brooches, lots of trumpet brooches and coins. So we're just starting to think about what the implications of that are, and a bit like the geophysics, there was a sort of distinct lack of post-Roman finds, really, And these are just two of the volunteers that we're carrying out the survey for us. Next slide, please. And finally, yes, just what now, really? So what has all this data done for us? Well, the main thing is that it has fed into the design of where we are putting our woodlands and wetlands. We know that planting woodlands can have a big impact on buried archaeology, and the same with wetlands. So we're avoiding those significant sites, ensuring that they are protected for future generations. We've also got a lot of data there, so we're carrying out a lot more research, and there's going to be analysis ongoing of some of those geophysics results. But we're also, you know, we've learned a lot from it. We've got a new understanding of the landscape, really, and we're really thinking about how we can start sharing some of those stories at Attingham. It's traditionally been very focused on the sort of mansion and the late 18th century story. So we're trying to think about how we might share some of those stories in the future. The images on the right are just examples of previous excavations that we have done at Attingham. And really we're hoping, I think, that at least one of those sites might be subject to some excavation in the near future. But what we're really looking to do is kind of carry on building up those stories so that visitors can understand that landscape.